The first step that we need to take is to think critically about the question of what is media content. And to explain this question, I'm going to introduce you to two people. Now, the person that you see on your screen here is a feminist media scholar, media critic called Anita Sarkeesian. And Anita Sarkeesian has done a lot of work on representations of women in video games and also in the video game industry. And I want to make sense of what she has to say about video game content through reference to an older scholar called George Gerbner, and particularly his idea of the cultural indicator. And what I aim to establish here is that Anita Sarkeesian's arguments about what gaming content represents and why we should look at it very much reflects Gerbner's idea of the cultural indicator. And the cultural indicator is a important and useful tool to understand what media content actually represents. Now, let's begin with Gerbner. Gerbner argued that media content is a bit like a footprint. So when you see a footprint in the snow, it's evidence of the person who made that footprint, right? So I suppose if you're a professional tracker, you might be able to use all sorts of things, all sorts of interpretive skills to guess the size of the person, the weight of the person, what that person might be from their footwear, and all of those sorts of things. So, what does that have to do with making sense of media content? Well, George Gerbner argued that media content is the same kind of evidence, that you can look at media content, and media content is an imprint of the industries. Of the industries that create media content, and indeed the wider societies in which they work. That is, from looking at media content, much like looking at a footprint, you can tell certain things about how the industries who made that footprint, that content works, and also how those industries are related to the larger societies within which they work. And Gerbner argued that the cultural indicator, we talk about economic indicators and things like that all of the time, don't we? We talk about certain kinds of evidence that give a clue about how society is traveling. And Gerbner thought that you could do pretty much the same thing with media content, that media content was an indicator of how society was structured and how society worked. And when you're doing quantitative content analysis, Gerbner was particularly interested in talking about the recurrent patterns in media content, the sorts of images and ideas that you see happening again and again and again. And he thought that it was worth doing this because he also thought that in looking at those recurrent patterns, you can tell something about what media industries value, what media industries prioritize, and also how that relates to social priorities. And Anita Sarkeesian's work on video game culture very much represents a current example of that. So Anita Sarkeesian has done a lot of research and a lot of work on enduring sexism in representations of women in video games. So she'll talk about the way that female characters in video games are very often objectified, and they're very infrequently the drivers of narratives. They're very frequently the victims of violence, or sometimes they're just not there at all. And Anita Sarkeesian's argument is as this represents broader forms of kind of sexism in society and in the gaming industry. So you can tell a lot about how the gaming industry is structured in terms of gender inequality by looking at the games that they produce. So again, we have this kind of footprint view of video game content, the idea that when you're looking at the content of a particular game. What you are really doing is you're trying to infer something about the industry and the society that produced that content. So that idea of the cultural indicator is a really important idea that you need to keep in mind when thinking about doing media content analysis.